All right. Just to reintroduce myself for the video, my name is Makaya Ramos. I am currently a tattoo artist, and I got my education and bachelor's in fine arts and illustration. And today we're going to be talking about color theory. So as far as color theory goes, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you the bare bone basics of color theory. I'm sure everybody has seen a color wheel, but just in case we forgot, I'm going to go ahead and share it with you. This is a basic color wheel, and a color wheel is essentially a rainbow. We go through our primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. Primary colors can create any other color on the color wheel except for white. So as far as mixing colors go, your primary colors are going to be your go-to for just about every single color you can possibly think of. Your immediate secondary colors are, you guessed it, secondary colors. So those are things like orange, green, and purple. And the reason they're secondary is because they are the most immediate color you can create from your primary colors. So if you mix red and yellow, you're going to get orange. If you mix yellow and blue, you're going to get green. And if you mix, blue and red, you'll get purple. So there's lots of different terms that we're going to run through, and I'm just going to kind of like rapid fire them to you because most of them are not super helpful as far as like practical application in a lot of art. We'll go over the basics real quick. We'll talk about analogous. And analogous just means that it's the three colors that are directly next to its partner color. So for example, on this grid, we have yellow, a lighter orange, and a darker orange. So those are analogous because they're right next to each other in the color wheel. They're similar to monochromatic. Monochromatic is similar to analogous, but it's not the same because monochromatic technically can only be changed with tone as far as like you have to mix white and black to create a monotone color scheme. While an analogous color scheme, you can use a shade difference. So you have like an orange to a lighter orange to yellow. And then as far as the next most important color schemes that we're going to talk about is complementary. And complementary is probably one of the more important color schemes artists want to know, right next to split complementary. They're essentially the same thing. It just means the color that is directly across the way from a color wheel. So you'll see a lot of complementary schemes in things like logos. So if we think of like Lakers jerseys, so for example, these are our complementary colors. So they're directly across the grid. So we have things like green and red. So we see that a lot in like Christmas colors. We have yellows and blues. We see that a lot in jerseys, like, the Swedish sports jerseys. We have yellow and purple. We get Lakers. And this is just one step away from what most color schemes usually end up looking like. And that's where we get split complementary color schemes. And that just means that you're going to pull it directly across the color wheel again, but you're going to choose the neighboring colors. So here's a little better of an example. I'm going to zoom in on it. So this right here would be a split complementary color scheme. And this is most likely what we're going to be working with today as far as practical application in our activity later at the end of the lecture. As far as remembering the color wheel, I have a silly song that I have just attached to since the day I learned it. And it has always been really helpful as far as trying to remember the general spiral. And it goes like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. That's the color of the rainbow. It's a very simple song. However, it comes in really handy when you're trying to recall what colors are going to work well for a certain color scheme. So another practical application as far as color theory in nature, especially in photography, you'll see how photographers apply color theory often. So for example, what we were talking about earlier with Laker colors, you have your purples and yellows, but then you usually end up having a third color that comes into play. So that's where you get your split complementary colors. So like take, for example, this photo of a lavender in a green field with yellow highlights. That would be a split complementary color scheme. Same thing with this. You have this beautiful purple sunset with spots of oranges and yellows, which again, it's a split complementary color scheme. And the best part about color theory is that it's hard to kind of see the practical applications if you don't see it in the world around you. So if you can try and do your best to remember the color wheel, you tend to see it more often than not pop up in natural landscapes. You'll see it in sunsets, you'll see it in color, like here, we'll look through some other options. We have things called warm tones and cool tones on our color wheel too. So this is generally a warm landscape for photography. And that goes back to our analogous colors, which are colors that are directly next to each other on the color wheel. Analogous colors tend to lean either on the cool side or the warm side. So usually these types of like constructions in images, it usually is trying to set a tone. So you'll see this a lot in film. If you're trying to set the mood of a scene, usually you're going to go off of an analogous color scheme, because almost immediately you're going to set a type of mood within your image according to whether or not it's on the cool side of the color wheel or on the warm side of the color wheel. Does anyone have any questions really fast before I move forward? I know that was kind of a rapid fire terms. Okay.
I just wanted to jump in and say that I can see how all of this is really important in tattoo design, because it's on skin and you want it to pop out. Like basically every person paying for a tattoo wants it to be strong and stand out.
Yeah. And honestly, a lot of the time as tattoo artists, we will choose colors according to skin tone. So a lot of the time people will have natural pigments of like hot reds, like people will have like undertones of either pinks or reds or even yellow. A lot of people have very yellow undertones in their skin. And so we'll pick a tone that either amplifies their natural color or is a complementary color from it, in order to kind of build that contrast. Sometimes if you put complementary tones against their natural pigment, it usually won't pop as well. So you want to get something that's not quite similar. So like for me, like I have a lot of orange undertones, and generally if you were to put orange ink on me, it's probably not going to come up because I have so much of that tone already very present in my skin. So you usually, I would probably lean more towards like reds and yellows. And a lot of the time the yellows will just end up turning orange because I have so much orange in my skin tone to begin with. But it's interesting because you'll look at someone of a similar complexion to me and it might be a completely different story. Like oranges might pop on them, but it's just because of the fact that they have a different color tone going on underneath. Is pink a secondary color? Well, let's go over to our color wheel real fast. Pink can be or no, I don't think it is technically a color. It's not technically a secondary color because secondary colors are strictly reserved for whatever the primary colors can make. The rest of the color wheel, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I believe it's just considered a hue when you mix. White and red make pink. That's why I asked. Yeah, so you're looking more at a monochromatic is what pink is probably going to fall under. Is going to be more like monochromatic because it's a color that's being influenced by either black or white. And in order to make pink, you need to have white pigment. Or you just think of the Lucky Charms commercial. No, is there a song in the Lucky Charms commercial? I don't know. Cool. Okay, great. Does anyone have any additional questions before I move on to our activity? No? Feeling good? I had a quick question. Do you have a preferred medium? Like, do you prefer paints or colored pencils? Do you prefer pastels? Any type of preferred way of executing color? Or are you more of a drawer? You prefer pencils or pens or inks? Pencils. Okay, great. That's usually where I started out too, honestly. I started out with mechanical pencils and then I moved on to ballpoint pen. And yeah, nice. That's awesome. Yeah, pens are honestly they became very, very practical when I actually moved into the tattooing industry, because you had to be very intentional about the strokes you would put on paper. With pencil, it's hard. It's easy to make mistakes because you can always erase. And I've always recommended to young artists, if you want to improve your skills, sometimes it's easier to work in pen because it trains you to be intentional about your strokes rather than kind of roughly laying out whatever your idea is. And that's fine at the end of the day. If you wanted to make something more textural, it's definitely applicable. But if you're trying to move towards something a little bit more like I guess like figure drawing, sometimes pen can help teach your brain to be more intentional about your design before you create it. As far as a few more little color theories I was going to go over, we're going to talk about our activity really fast and see how that applies. So I have two examples of what we could be making today. I don't know if you guys can see them super well. Let me know if you can see the drawings. All right.
Yes.
You're looking good. Okay. So here we have just like a classic Apple study. I wanted to talk briefly about light source and the names of tones and shadows within objects, because it's definitely applicable in just about everything in art. I wanted to show also color schemes that we have going on here. These are mostly split complementary color schemes. And the reason why is because this is a blue piece of paper and we're using red and orange as our main tones, but we can use yellow as a highlight. So usually in art, you'll usually pick a baseline color scheme, especially when you're working with split complementary schemes. So the base of this color scheme is going to be blue, red, and orange according to our color wheel. However, because of the fact that, you know, art doesn't always look super great if it's restricted to just a few colors, you usually want to throw in things like highlights and contrast. And where we get that is our white and black. Obviously, white amplifies highlights and yellows can just bring out the tones that we already have here. So if you wanted to pair an analogous color scheme within a split complementary color scheme, usually that's what most artists do when you create a composition. So for example, here we have a very similar color scheme as this one, it's just flipped. So red is our color scheme. So we're not going to use red anymore because red is the base tone of our paper. We're going to use greens, and blues, because those are what's directly across the way on our color wheel. So what's directly across the color wheel from red is blue, and right next to that blue is going to be our greens. And so again, you'll see like a lot of sunsets tend to look like this. Like you'll have like blues and greens and purples as shadows. And then the setting of the actual area is going to be like warm tones. And a really helpful thing just to keep in mind when you do drawings, lighting has a really, really big influence on your color scheme. So I'm sure you've seen this, like a lot of natural lighting, like sunshine, that's a lot of warm tones. You're going to get a lot of yellows and oranges and reds, versus like LED lights or indoor lighting is very cold. You can even see it just on our Zoom meeting. Like I have a lot more warm light coming in, while Becca and Michelle have very cold light. I have cold light coming in from behind me, but the lighting that's hitting my face is more warm. And that is going to influence your shadows. A good way to think about shadows is that it's always going to be the opposite of the tones that the lighting is itself. So if you have warm lighting, you're going to have cool shadows. If you have cool lighting, you're going to have warm shadows. So if, let's take for example, the apple. So the apple has very warm lighting. It's got a lot of yellows and oranges, but the shadow is going to be cool. It's going to be purples and blues and maybe even greens. And you'll see that a lot in nature. I wish I had a still life or something to show you guys, but it's just a helpful thing to keep in mind when you're thinking color theory. Let me see if I can find a good example of cool shadows inside of a landscape. All right. Sorry about this, a little bit of a delay. Okay, so here's a good example. I'm gonna go ahead and screen share really fast. Desktop share. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, so we're gonna look at this still life to my right. So we have a lot of warm highlights right here, right? But then if you look at the actual shadows behind this metallic color, if you were to just like take a little piece of that, it's very, very blue. It's almost like teals on the back sides of this. Same thing on this little white pot. Like you'll see a lot of like, and I know it looks gray, but if you were to like take this into Photoshop and use the eyedropper tool and just grab it, it's very, very, very purpley blue, cool tones that you'll see. And you'll see that a lot in these like, just like general still lifes. So we have like this very cold highlight. And then you have this more orangey, woody kind of shadow that's happening behind the pot. And I know it's a little hard to see. It's a really dark shadow. And a lot of the time you won't really see it right out the bat. Usually it's going to be almost like an undertone of the shadow itself, because shadows tend to be so dark. Oh, here's actually a good example. So you see how the shadow is like almost like lilac purple / blue. And that's because we have a very hot yellow highlight going on. And so that's really, really helpful. If you're ever drawing just anything, if your highlight is going to be yellow, usually you're going to be doing the exact complementary color of whatever that highlight is. So for example, on my screen, if my highlight is yellow, if the complementary of yellow is either blues or purples, you're going to be in that general area. How do I stop sharing? Here we go. Okay. Any questions really fast about just cast shadows or tones or highlights, general things that nature? We're feeling good. All right, let's go ahead and move on. I'm going to go ahead and talk about shadows really fast before we get into our activity. Just to break it down, I don't know if you guys can read it. It looks flipped on my screen. But I'm just going to quickly go over some things. So everything that you see within art will almost always have like an academic name. So this is considered our highlight. This is considered our tone. This is considered our core shadow, which is a shadow that lies on an object, but it is not the cast shadow. So a cast shadow is whatever an object casts off of it. So you'll usually see that most cast shadows have a very hard edge. So while a core shadow tends to have a softer, more subtle edge. And then the thing in between a cast shadow and a core shadow is called reflective light. And almost everything will have reflective light because whatever an object is sitting on, the surface is going to reflect back towards it. And usually that reflective light is opposite to whatever the highlight is. It's not here. I should have probably shown that a little better, but it was because it was on a blue piece of paper. I didn't want to overdo the blue. But just to show you, I'll quickly kind of fill it in with blue. You'll usually see that within all of nature. You'll have exceptions, of course, to the rule. But as far as like cheat codes, when you do draw, it's always good to kind of keep those things in mind. Your reflective light, here, let's see, I'll show a good example of reflective light. Okay, let's go ahead and screen share again. Okay, so here's a version of reflective light, but in a black and white version, just to make it a little easier to see what's going on. We have our highlight again. We have our reflective light that's coming off the surface of wherever the ball is sitting. And then we have our cast shadow. Here we go. Here's a good example. So you can see that the reflective light that's coming onto this ball is usually the same color of the surface that it's sitting on, while the light source is different. And even though this might appear to be a very cool light tone, again, if you were to pull this into, like, let's say Photoshop and grab it, the top of this is almost like a very pale red, which makes sense because we have a green undertone. And again, here's another example. We have a nice bright yellow highlight on a green ball, which creates this deep blue shadow. It's super helpful to keep in mind these types of shadows when you're creating any kind of art because it makes it more convincing. It tricks the brain to believe that what you're seeing is realistic. The activity, as far as what we're going to do, you're welcome to draw the examples I've laid out, but you're also welcome to draw whatever you want. I just wanted to see if you guys can apply what you learned today to the activity. So if you can apply either a split complementary color scheme or even a complementary color scheme, you can also do a monotone study if you'd like and just use the black and white pastels and pick one color. So we can either do a monotone study like this with just 3 colors, or you can do a split complementary color scheme. And it depends on what color paper you're using too. So you want to take into account whatever color paper you're using, it's going to affect what colors you're going to be using on the paper according to the color scheme. I'm going to use a green piece of paper this time. And if we're going to be using a green piece of paper, that would mean that I'm either going to be using red or purple. And because I don't have a purple pastel, I'm probably just going to use a blue, like a dark, dark blue. All right, so let's go ahead and move over to our activity. If I'm doing a tree, I'm going to use my red and blue because I'm going to try and do a split complementary scene. Because of the fact that red and blue is a little one note, I'm probably going to throw in a couple of colors that are directly next to those colors. So I can probably throw in a light blue and a yellow, maybe even an orange. So that way that we have general tones to kind of follow along with, okay? Good, you can see the tree. Okay. So I'm gonna make it into more of a sideways composition. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with blue, my dark blue, just to sketch, just to get a rough idea of our landscape. I'm gonna go ahead and make just a line across the way to show where my landscape's gonna start. And then trees, the beauties of trees is that they are very abstract. You don't really have to follow any particular way of doing a tree, but trees tend to, you know, they get blown around, they get thrown around by the elements. So usually I try to make it have some type of motion. So I'm just gonna draw like a rough squiggle going across the page. And then I can create some interesting shapes. So I'm gonna start here, I'll create like a trunk, and then I will create a general shape for the top of the tree. And then that's the other thing about art that I think a lot of people try to overcomplicate because your brain sees a lot of information, but most things in art can be broken down into shapes. So most things in nature, most things in people, like hands and feet, can all be broken down into shapes. And so that's all I'm really doing right now is I'm just creating shapes. So I'm creating a general like block shape to follow the tree trunk. And then I'm going to create maybe a couple of random branches supporting. And then I'll create my shapes. So we're going to have some big old circles kind of just to frame the bottom of the tree. And then maybe a couple oddball branches coming out here. Okay. And then I'm going to decide my light source from here. Because of the bulk of my focal point is on this side, I'm going to go ahead and do my light source coming in from this direction. So what I'm going to go over here, I'm going to grab my yellow, which is going to be my highlight. Another good thing to keep in mind when you're drawing is you always want to reinforce form. So if my tree is following this circular pattern, I'm going to draw in the direction of that circular pattern to reinforce the way it looks. You want to trick your brain into seeing what's there instead of just kind of scribbling in color. You kind of just want to make sure that the colors themselves are showing shape. I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of orange just underneath my highlight. And then the beauty of oil pastels is that you can mix really, really easy with oil pastels. So you can always kind of layer on top of the other one and get a blended kind of look to it. And since red is my darkest color tone, I'm going to use that as my lower, like almost like shadow tone. It's going to be right before I hit my shadows because it's the darkest tone that I'm going to be using on my tree. And I'm just going to fill up that area. And you can kind of see how those forms are slowly becoming more and more convincing because I'm trying to reinforce that area. Okay, and so I'm going to grab my blues again, and I'm going to make this tree trunk a little bit more convincing. Because this is my darkest blue, I'm going to go ahead and go in on the side that has the hardest shadows and just really push that form. Okay, and then because our light source is coming in from this direction, we're probably going to have a shadow coming out this way. So we'll pull that shadow over from our tree, right? And now I'm going to grab my light blue and go ahead and reinforce some of those highlights that are coming in from this area. And since my highlights on my tree are pretty warm, I might go ahead and put a little bit of those warm tones on this side as well. So I might pull some oranges just to kind of make it feel a little bit more convincing, maybe a little bit of yellow to edge it. And for the tree itself, I'm going to go ahead and grab some of my blues, maybe pull some of that in there, mix it around a little bit. Now we're almost getting like a pink kind of color. That's the nice part about art. Like, even if you're trying to do rigid color theory, sometimes you'll get like really interesting kind of colors going on, just because of the fact that pigments work a little differently than light itself. And that's where you get some really cool art. It's like, even though you're following the basics of color theory, it kind of creates its own thing when you apply those ideas. I'm just going to look at it really fast. All right. And then I'm going to create a little bit of texture in our leaves just to edge out the tree, make it feel a little bit more convincing. Make it feel a little bit more tree-like. Kind of feels like video game trees. You'll see that a lot in video games. Like, a lot of video games tend to simplify shapes because of the fact that the software can't usually support a fully rendered tree. And so sometimes even just drawing cartoons can become very practical when you're trying to learn how to do some of these more basic forms. And so I'm going to go ahead and just continue to reinforce those textures of the tree, but I'm still following those original shapes that I kind of created when I was first sketching out our tree. And art, a lot of the time, is just reinforcing. You're going to just keep going back through reinforcing your darks and lights. And that's how you create more fully rendered projects, is just reinforcing tone. So I'm just trying to reinforce my shadows. I'm trying to reinforce my highlights. I'm trying to pull some more textures as I'm going through. Since I'm pulling a lot of this red down underneath my tree, it's creating this really nice kind of purple color because it's mixing in with our blue that we added earlier. And then from here, we have like a cute little tree friend, just like Bob Ross. And then I'm gonna make the environment a little bit more convincing, right? So I'm gonna just kind of create a highlight on our floor. Maybe pull some of that orange on the edge of our shadow. It can moves. All right. And now for some of the more finishing touches, I'm probably going to throw in a little bit of white and black to kind of, again, we're trying to reinforce those shadows. So usually black is a helpful contraster tool. You usually want to use it as something to edge, but also something to use as like as our core shadow, right? So we still have core shadows and cast shadows happening even on this tree. Like we have our highlight and we have our tone and then we have our shadow, but there should be a core shadow within this. So I might just pull the black and reinforce some of that core shadow and pull it up. So it's not quite the bottom of the tree. It's just above the very, very bottom, because some of that light is going to catch the edges of the tree. It's not actually going to be a perfect black. It's just to kind of reinforce some of those leafy textures that we got going on. I might use a little bit more black on this side of the tree just because our highlights are on this side. Another good note to keep in mind is that wherever your strongest highlight is, a lot of the time is where you'll have the hardest black. And so that's why I'm going to probably make this particular branch much darker than maybe the others. Okay, pull in some of those shadows. And then because our tree is looking a little too smooth for my particular taste, I might go back through and make a little bit of swirly textures, create some cool little shapes, make it interesting, and then maybe show a little bit of those root textures, maybe show a couple little strands of grass coming up. And then I'm going to grab my white and show that edge real hard on the edge of this trunk. And I'm probably not going to pull it all the way up because you really want to use white sparingly. White should only be used on the very, very hottest spot of any type of composition as far as reinforcing highlights. White is not a super common color in nature. And a lot of the time it's usually mixed with another color. And even though it might appear to be white, it's probably not a perfect white. It's probably a mixture of a couple other colors and your white. Same thing with black. Like black is not really like a real color in nature. Usually black is a mixture of other things. It helps in art, of course, to make things feel a little bit more convincing. And then I'm just going to kind of reinforce some of this cast shadow just on the edges of the shadow again, because I don't want to lose that blue tone that we kind of have inside of our shadow because it feels real. I might even put a little bit of red inside of this blue to make it more purple, because again, if we're on a green piece of paper using red and orange, we're probably going to be using more purple if anything, but since we don't have a purple pastel, we just got to do it the old-fashioned way and mix it. A nice thing with pastels again is you can kind of use your finger to, like, if you wanted to smudge some of the areas and make them a little smoother. Let's see what we're looking at. Cool. So another thing that's really nice about having a direction when we're using tones is usually sometimes you'll see light coming through trees, right? Like you'll see that in nature. So I'm just probably going to take my finger and drag a little bit in the direction of our light source, right? We're going to drag, and maybe just drag the edges of our leaves a little bit. And then we can even grab a little bit of our yellow and kind of tone between some of those drags that we did. You don't have to get excessive, but just something to make it feel more real. You probably have more of that yellow tone coming off of the highlight side anyways. Cool. And then what I'm probably going to do is I might do a little bit of blue on this side of our sky, just to make it feel more like a sky. At this point, guys, you are welcome to kind of divert from whatever I'm doing and just kind of put your own spin on it. Usually this is where your own personal expression really kind of shines through. And you are welcome to express that however that looks. If you wanted to reinforce, since we already got a green piece of paper, we can use our green, darker green pastel, you know, and go through and kind of maybe make more of a grassy look. Double check what we're looking at. Yeah. And that's pretty much essentially it. You are always welcome to keep going through and make it look however you want to look. The beauty again of these oil pastels is you can layer and layer all day and continue to just reinforce whatever you're trying to make. If I wanted to go back through, you can use tools too with oil textures. So I have this little like pen cap, right? If I didn't want to use my finger for a smudging look, if I wanted to create more of a sharper kind of textured look, which is what I'm going to do on the tree leaves, I can kind of just run through and smudge some of these textures just to break up the black so it doesn't look so blocky and it feels a little bit smoother. You can use like a pen tip, and the only thing with oil pastels that's a little bit of a bummer is that because they're oil based, it might have a hard time mixing with other mediums. So if you wanted to run through with like graphite or ink, it might not work super well, just because of the way that the pastels are made. But you can kind of see how it's making these textures feel a little bit more convincing and not so abstract. Kind of run through. And like I said, you don't have to use a pencil cap if you wanted to use like the back of a pen or a dull pencil. You can use just about anything to work as a smudging tool. I remember in art school, you're required to buy supplies at the beginning of your semester, and I wouldn't ever buy the smudging objects because pretty much anything can be used to smudge. That's the beauty of art. Art can be made from just about anything, honestly. It doesn't have to be restricted to the most expensive materials or some particular, like you can't make something look a type of way without something else. And usually you can finesse it to one degree or another. Okay, how's everyone doing? is everybody making their stuff? We can add maybe like, I don't know, we can add a couple little clouds. Who wants clouds? And again, with the clouds, you're going to still be applying your color theory. So I'm going to put in a blue cloud, but I know that my tones, my highlights are still going to probably be yellow. So keeping in mind of my color scheme, I'm probably going to put the top of these clouds a little bit on the more yellow side, and then maybe mix some white in underneath that. Add a couple more cloud friends. I got the Bob Ross lingo going. I'm gonna hit it with a little bit of yellow on the top. Maybe a little bit of white. And in order to do some of my warmer textures. I'm probably going to come in and put just the tiniest bit of red underneath my cloud and reinforce it with the blue and put some white on top of that. And you don't have to use a lot of tones when you mix with white on oil pastel, like it'll kind of create the color. You can grab some of your red, and I'm just barely grazing the paper itself. Graze, and then I'm going to go in with my white and use it as a mixing tool. And I create this really nice, pretty pink, purpley color that we got going on. That's the nice part again about oil pastels is you can mix colors pretty easily. Okay, what's going on? One more thing is that landscapes, usually your horizon, like the very bottoms of your horizon are going to be lighter than whatever the top of the sky is looking like. So I might run through with my light blue near the base of our horizon, just to kind of show where the bottom of my composition is ending. And then I'll probably come back through the top and use some of this darker blue. Okay, I'm probably just going to smudge everything a little bit with my finger, soften everything up. Because skies tend to be real soft and squishy. Okay. Let's see what we're looking at. Cool. Feels good, feels right. How are we all doing over here? I don't know if this is something you can see super well. I might bring my light a little closer so you can see. It's just a rough idea, but if I really wanted to, I could come back through on this trunk and like clean up some things. But yeah, you got like a nice little fall time tree going on since you got the nice pretty green, oranges and yellows and things. I might run through with a little bit more blue. Okay. Okay. And again, since we're going to be making our horizon line a little bit lighter than everything else, I'm just going to run a little bit of white on the base of our horizon. Okay. So trees are not easy. Trees are definitely weirdly shaped things. And sometimes it's hard to create things that are in nature because usually they're pretty abstract in shape. So that's why there's no such thing as an ugly tree, because it could be a tree somewhere. Somewhere is a tree. Hope you learned some fun things. And like I said, if you ever have any questions about color theory, just look at a color wheel or recite the silly song. If you're ever in a pickle, it'll help remember what colors to use when you're picking out a color scheme. And yeah, thanks so much for coming through, guys. Glad we could make it happen.